Just like you can have an array of any data type, you can also have an array of pointers. Once you have an array of pointers, you could then dynamically allocate multiple arrays, where the memory addresses of these arrays are stored in the array. For example, what if you had a program about esports players at TTU who major in computer science, and you're trying to figure out how many hours each player plays for each esports game that they play? For example, let's say we had 3 esports players, and the first esports player played 3 games, and the second esports player played 7 games, and the third one played 5 games. And then for each of those games, so for example, for the first player and the first game, they played that game 4 hours. The second game they played 28 hours, and the third game they played 13 hours. If you were going to do this, you would first want to get the number of players. In my example, I said that there were 3. Then you would need to dynamically allocate the num games array based on the number of players. So this would be a 3-element array. And then for each player, you would get the number of games that that player plays and place it in this array. So in my example, the first player played 3 games, second player played 7 games, and third player played 5 games. Then you would want to dynamically allocate an array after you get the number of players and number of games from each user. Okay, so this is what the code would look like in order to dynamically allocate this array right here, which is an integer array. Num players is 3, and then placing the memory address of this new array in num games. So num games is basically the name of our array. Now, the last step, or not last step, but third step, is to dynamically allocate the player hours array based on the number of players. This is the array that you saw in this first slide. This is the player hours array. So to create an array of pointers, you're actually going to create the pointer with 2 stars instead of just 1. This first part that I have in blue shows that each array element in this array is going to be a pointer to an integer. They're going to be pointers. The second star here indicates that this particular variable is a pointer itself, and that's why there are 2 stars. Then, once you know the number of players, you can then dynamically allocate this array of pointers. See that it's 3 elements because of my number of players is 3. And after the new operator, each element is going to be a pointer to an integer. So that's why there are pointers in each of these elements. Now, right now, they don't point to anything, but they're allowed to point to an integer or an integer array. And then the name of the array is player hours, because the memory address returned from new gets placed inside of that player hours pointer. Once you have the array of pointers, you then get the number of games of how many games each player plays. Then, after you do that, you can, in a loop, get or dynamically allocate these arrays that you see of integers. So in this loop, you will first create this array for the first player. So think of I as being 0. So num game sub 0 is 3. And so we're going to create a new integer array of size 3. That's this array right here. Let me highlight it. Okay, so I just created this array with this line right here, where I is 0. Okay, then where do we put the memory address? Well, the memory address is stored in this first element of the player hours array. So that's why I have player hours sub I. And remember, I is 0. So if this is in a loop, that means we would do this for 0, and then I would be incremented to 1. And then we would look at what size or what number is in numGames sub 1. Well, that's a 7. And so let me erase all on slide and start fresh with this first one. Oops. So now I'm looking at element with index 1 in the numGames array, and I'm also going to be looking at the element with index 1 in the player hours array. And this part right here that I'm highlighting will dynamically allocate this array of size 7 and then put the memory address of that array inside of player hours sub I. Now, all this that I've been describing so far only just creates these arrays. It doesn't actually allow the user to enter in the data in those arrays. So you would need an additional for loop after this line right here that I'm highlighting that would allow the user to enter in these numbers. And whenever you are entering in the numbers, you're going to enter it in using a 2D array format. Look at this line right here. Notice that it says player hours sub I sub j, where I is the index values in the player hours array, and j is the index values in this array that was dynamically allocated for this single player. So let me clear all the ink again. If I is 1, let's say, okay, if I is 1 and j, let's say, is 2, then where is that going to be entered? Right here, just so you get an idea. I created a program called Array of Pointers, and this is a different program or problem than the one about the esports players. This is a program that will hold song titles of multiple CDs. And this program dynamically allocates an array of pointers. Each of the pointers in the array will eventually point to an array of strings. Let's take a look at this program. Okay, in the main function, I created CD array, which is a pointer, and it's a pointer that will eventually point to an array of pointers, and that's why I have 2 stars there. And then I have numSongs, which is also a pointer. And then I have numCDs. Running out of space here. numCDs, which is an integer. On line 20, I ask the user, how many CDs do you have? And I read that in. To keep this simple, I'm just going to say 2. Then on line 23, so always look at the right side of this statement first. We're going to create a new array, and the size of the array is based off of num_cds, and each array element will be a pointer to a string. So I'm going to create this array here. It's a 2-element array because num_cds is 2. And then new will return the memory address, which gets placed in CD array. So CD array is the name of this array. Then I also dynamically allocated another array. This array is an integer array, and it is of the size num_cds as well. So it is also a 2-element array, which is going to hold integers. And then the new operator returns the memory address, which gets placed inside of num_songs. Then I call the enter data function, sending the CD array, the num_songs array, and the number of CDs. Look at how I pass these variables to the functions. I make sure that CD array is string star star, num_songs is int star, and num_cds is an integer. I then have a for loop where I have my loop variable is I, and I is going to iterate, or this loop is going to iterate through our arrays. And so the size is num_cds. It will print out, the first time we're in this loop, for CD1, how many songs are on it. And we'll read that into num_songs. Let's say that there's 4 songs. So that would get placed here. Then, on line 64, we will dynamically allocate a new array. What is the size of the array? num_songs sub I. So remember I is 0 right now. So num_songs sub 0 is 4. So we're going to create a string array that is 4 elements. I'm going to draw it vertically so it'll fit. And this is going to hold strings. And the memory address of this array will be placed inside of CD array sub I. So I'm right there in the code. CD array sub I is 0, and so that's going to create this connection right here. Then I'm going to have a for loop that will iterate through this array that I just created. And so the size of the array is 4, num_songs sub I, and it's going to print out song title, and then we will read in the values into this array, the strings from the user. Notice the 2D array syntax, I and X. So I indicates the index value for the CD array, X indicates the index value for the array I just dynamically allocated that I drew in pink. So pretend these are song titles. I know they're really squiggly lines, but pretend that those are song titles and we've just entered them in. Now this loop is done and we go back to the outer loop. I increments to 1. 1 is still less than 2. For CD2, how many songs are on it? Let's say this time there's only 3 songs, which would go into num_songs sub 1. Then we dynamically allocate. So we're going to create a new string array of size num_songs sub 1, which is 3. So this will create a 3-element array. And the memory address is going to go inside of CD array sub 1, right there. Then we have our for loop, which allows us to fill up the array elements in this array that we just created, where I is the index value of CD array, and X is the index value of this array we just created. And so after this for loop, executes, we will have song titles in each of those array elements. Then this for loop ends. We go back up to the outer for loop. I increments to 3. 3 is not less than 2. Bumps us out of that loop, which bumps us out of the inner data function. Now, after the inner data function, what variables go away? Well, the I variable goes away. This CD array, which was temporarily created for this function, but it holds a memory address. So that's still, I'm just going to keep that there. And same thing for num songs. And num CDs is a temporary variable which goes away. I didn't draw these variables again. And then the X variable goes away. However, these dynamically allocated arrays do not go away, even though they were dynamically allocated in this function, because they're created in the heap and they're not removed until I delete them. So I'll go back to where I called the inner data function, which was on line 27, and then I get to line 30. And the purpose of the double for loop on lines 30 through 37 is just to print out each of the songs. And so we have to have nested for loop where R indicates the index value for both the CD array and the num songs array. And this inner for loop is so that we can iterate through these string arrays with the song names. And so how do we access these strings? Well, kind of like a 2D array where R stands for row and C stands for column. And we would just print them out. Now, let's talk about how are we going to actually release all of this dynamically allocated data. It's very important that you do this in this exact order. Because if we first delete the CD array, which would delete that right there, we would no longer have access to these dynamically allocated arrays. So instead of doing that, we need to first go through this array, the CD array, in a for loop and delete the arrays pointed to by these array elements, which is CD array sub and then an index value. So CD array sub 0 is the pointer that points to this first dynamically allocated array, and we would delete that first. Then R would increment to 1, and we would delete CD array sub 1, which would delete the second array. Then we're done with this for loop. We can then delete the CD array, and then we can delete the num songs array. Then at return 0, all the other local variables go away. So we made sure we didn't have any memory leaks in this particular program.